lodge the petition, followed by up to 4 other members, followed by a minister in response. And to conclude the debate, the first speaker, which of course is the member for Orange, will reply. After all members have spoken, the House will vote on the question. That the House take note of the petition, and this question will in most cases be determined on the voices and be passed. However, if this is challenged by a member, it may proceed to a division where the bells are rung and members vote on the motion to take note of the petition by sitting on the appropriate sides of the House. So the question is that the House take note of the petition. I now call the member for Orange.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome to the gallery representatives of the New South Wales Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, CEO and former member of this place, Mr Jai Rao, President Lance Miller, Operations Manager George Grease, and Communications Manager Emma Taviani, who initiated and drove this very important e-petition. I also welcome the thousands of SSAA members and shooters from across the state who are watching this online. It is an honour to speak on behalf of the 28,456 signatures who signed the petition in response to the negative consequences of the Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill 2020. This e-petition is record-breaking in that it is the fastest growing and the largest in the history of the New South Wales Parliament e-petitions. In just under 2 weeks, the e-petition garnered more than 25,000 signatures. Within the first week, the e-petition, the monumental traffic from signatures crashed the Parliament website twice. By the end of March, e-petition had grown to the largest e-petition in New South Wales history, closing in with over 28,400 signatures. If ever there was a poorly drafted bill introduced into the New South Wales Parliament, this is it. Clumsy, vague and without extensive amendment, would have severe consequences for the hundreds of thousands of licensed firearms owners in this state, including farmers, sporting shooters and hunters. The bill is about introducing new offences aimed at preventing illegal manufacture of firearms and firearms parts by, in the Minister's own words, quotation, serious criminals. However, with this present bill, there is substantial risk of negative consequences for licensed shooters. The bill was rightly referred for detail through scrutiny through an inquiry into the Legislative Council chaired by the Honourable Robert Borsak. The inquiry received 267 submissions and many concerns were raised. First, the lack of safeguards in the statutory defence against prosecution for firearms licence holders who make legitimate repairs, maintenance and adjustments to registered firearms. Many submissions pointed out that, like all sporting enthusiasts, firearm owners need to repair, maintain and in some cases modify their equipment. These are entirely lawful actions supported and promoted in the New South Wales Firearms Registry 2006 booklet, Firearms Long Arms Users Guide, Rights, Wrongs and Responsibilities. During the inquiry, Acting Deputy Commissioner Mark Walton of the New South Wales Police Force acknowledged that licensed firearms owners undertaking maintenance of their registered firearms would remain within the law. However, unless explicit safeguard provisions are included, there is a risk that licensed firearms owners undertaking repairs and maintenance to their registered firearms would be captured under this bill. There is a risk that they could become unwitting victims of overzealous enforcement. Second, the bill erodes a citizen's privilege against self-incrimination and the common law rights of a right to silence and a presumption of innocence. The bill is written as if these basic legal rights should not extend to licensed and lawful firearms owners. The bill, as it is written, violates these basic common law principles. The third issue of concern raised in many submissions to the inquiry was the lack of consultation with stakeholders. Regrettably, the bill was not circulated for public consultation by this government, and it is easy to understand why. This government has made it clear that it has little interest in recognising the basic legal rights or interests of lawful licensed firearms owners. Thankfully, the Legal Affairs Committee held its inquiry and gave stakeholders the opportunity to voice their concerns. Lastly, the use of the drug manufacturing term precursor in the bill, which, if unamended, will apply to common household and hardware tools and products, and would render almost every licensed firearm owner a criminal under this bill. What farm shed or suburban garage in Australia doesn't have tools such as drills, hacksaws, oil, scrap metal and timber, all precursors under this bill? As my time is limited, I will conclude by restating this bill has major problems today, and I've only touched on a few of them. The inquiry undertaken in the other place made 9 recommendations. These recommendations go a long way to improving a poor bill and helping to meet its intended aim of preventing unauthorised manufacture of firearms and firearms parts by serious criminals. Most importantly, the committee's recommendations include protecting licensed firearms owners against unintended consequences of this bill. The Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party and shooters throughout New South Wales look forward to the government supporting these recommendations.
Mr. Speaker.
Well, I thank the member for Orange. I now call the member for Coffs Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognise the members of the Sporting Shooters Association online, but also Coffs Harbour resident Lance Miller, who's the President, CEO Gyrell and the staff who are with them today. The Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill 2020 will not have a disproportionate effect on the people of regional New South Wales. Legitimate firearms licence holders on farms or rural properties will not be treated like criminals because they have a shed full of tools. Police will not have the power to search property on that basis alone. There needs to be a reasonable suspicion that the items are being used or intend to be used for the taking part in the unauthorised manufacture of firearms or firearm parts before police can use their powers. To be clear about firearm precursors, the mere possession of household items or hardware found in anyone's machinery shed or storage area are not an offence. It is only if these items are possessed for the purposes of taking part in an unauthorised manufacture where an offence would occur. There is not and never has been any intention that the new offence would capture the cleaning, maintenance and servicing of a registered firearm held by a licence holder. Primary producers, pest controllers, hunters and shooting club members can continue to undertake these activities without meeting the threshold of the offence. The suggestion that overzealous police would target legitimate licence holders do not give New South Wales Police Force enough credit to understand that the law they must enforce. Sadly, organised crime is infiltrating into regional areas of New South Wales. This year, the State Crime Command's Criminal Groups Squad Strike Force Haythorn charged a fifth man with the shooting and robbery of a truck driver last year in Lithgow. Rural communities are not immune from gun violence perpetrated by serious and organised criminals, and this bill is attempting to protect them and not make legitimate firearms possession and use more complicated. Operation Athena, for example, is a national law enforcement group comprising of police from jurisdictions across Australia with assistance from the Australian Federal Police and Australian Border Force. A national week of action across Australia targeting the trafficking and use of illicit firearms ran from the 15th to 21st of March 2021. This operation including detectives from the New South Wales Police Force and the Australian Federal Police arresting and charging a 33-year-old man in Coolamon near Wagga Wagga on firearms and drug-related offences. It will be alleged in court that this senior member of the Rebels Outlaw motorcycle gang attempted to import parts for prohibited firearms. The National Chair of Operation Athena is Detective Superintendent John Watson from New South Wales Police Drug and Firearms Squad. The week of action sends a timely message to those who deal with illicit firearms. Operation Athena not only focuses on disrupting illegal activity, but also encourages licensed firearms holders to store guns safely and securely to help police reduce the risk of guns being stolen and diverted into the illegal market. The operation highlights that this is a national law enforcement priority. New South Wales is working closely with other agencies in Australia and overseas to build a global web of information about those buying and selling illicit firearms and firearm parts. Mr. Speaker, this bill is another step in ensuring our laws are responsive and agile as they can be to deal with these threats. The elements relating to knowledge is an important one. It is important to ensure that persons that are under a genuine belief that they are participating in a lawful manufacturing process are not inadvertently committing a criminal offence. Ultimately, this offence is not intended to target the distant and unrelated persons who genuinely have no knowledge they are involved in the illegal manufacture of firearms. Police need the power, when seizing or detaining the items related to the offence, to direct a person to provide assistance or information to enable the officer to access information. These proposed access powers recognise that encryption or security features are used by criminals to hide evidence relating to illicit activities. The fear that this has been engendered that these provisions expose ordinary residents of New South Wales who have done nothing wrong to invasive and intrusive actions is misleading and scurrilous. This bill is not targeting law-abiding citizens. This bill is not targeting firearms licence holders who do the right thing in looking after their firearms and complying with the Act. This bill is making it harder for criminals to operate in the state, but will also support legislation that supports the rights of farmers and sporting shooters.
Before I call the member for Barwon, I do want to acknowledge, of course, in the gallery, and I meant to do it earlier, and I do apologise, is Lance Miller, Rob Austin, George Grease, my very good friend and former member of this place, Jai Rao, and Emma Teviana. My apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly. But anyway, welcome to the chamber. Now to the member for Barwon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, no one wants to see criminal use of firearms. Criminal use of firearms tarnishes the good reputation of law-abiding firearms owners and increases fear of crime in the community. All legislation and regulation around firearms should put public safety first. The SFF have no problem with New South Wales Police having increased resources to deal with the criminal use of firearms. Illegal manufacture of firearms needs to be stamped out, but this bill is off target. And over 28,000 New South Wales citizens agree. The ePetition reaching the threshold in record time and with a record number of signatures. With almost 250,000 licence holders in New South Wales, this is something the Minister and the New South Wales Government should pay attention to. If trusted peak groups like the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, New South Wales and New South Wales farmers are formally raising concerns, again, New South Wales Government should be paying attention. I remember as a young fellow, Mr Speaker, in the 80s, I worked on a chook farm. In between collecting eggs, I used to knock pest birds off the sheds and in the sheds. We mostly used an old Gammo 22 air rifle. The poor old thing had been so well used that the trigger sear had worn. Trigger sear works like that, Mr Speaker. Over time it wears out. It could fire if you knocked or bumped it. We disassembled, we built up the metal on the sear with a MIG welder, then ground and filed it so the trigger sear would catch properly again and be safe. Think about that. We made the air rifle safe to use again. We also shortened and recut a grub screw that had been lost. Under this bill, we could be charged for these repairs, for fixing an old air rifle. Is that acceptable to this Parliament? What do these actions have to do with public safety? In meetings with the Minister and senior police, we have repeatedly raised concerns that people with no criminal intent could be caught up in this. Just about every property, especially farms in New South Wales, would have items that could be defined as precursors. Scrap metal, old gal water pipes, drills, mills and lathes. It's telling that the New South Wales Police Deputy Commissioner agreed with what we were saying. People with no criminal intent could be charged. Mr Speaker, farmers and country people are generally a pretty cluey bunch. Big distances and isolation from suppliers means they tend to be able to fix most things on their property or home with a bit of ingenuity and creative problem solving. They can make up parts to keep machines and equipment working. The bill as it stands could see farmers charged for repairing a legally held firearm. No risk to public safety, none whatsoever. Whatever happened to the view in 2007 that as part of a responsible firearms ownership was maintaining a firearm? By definition, maintenance includes repairs. In 2007, the Firearms Long Arms Users Guide, Rights, Wrongs and Responsibilities, makes several references to home firearm repairs. It actually refers to a duty of care for firearm owners to maintain their firearms. It has the line, and I quote, "If you are not adept at firearms repair," and then goes on to list the people you could seek assistance from. It talks about the obligation to keep it, the firearm, in good repair. The legislation has not changed in this regard. This document, with multiple references to owners repairing their firearms, is still accessible on the New South Wales Police website today. Where is the proof that law-abiding people repairing legally held firearms impacts public safety? There are already rules around overall length, barrel length, modifications to change the action type, etc. There's been a great surge in people participating in shooting sports, target pistol shooting, clay target shooting, recreational hunting, and a plethora of target rifle shooting events that individuals and families participate in. People of different sizes and builds mean that grips, stocks, sights, even triggers need to be adjusted or changed. The way this bill is written can be interpreted that these are parts. If a shotgun stock needs to be shortened, lengthened, the comb raised or lowered, people could fall foul of this bill as written. What does that have to do with public safety? For collectors who service and maintain firearms that are often 200 plus years old, if they need to replace or repair a part or install a failed spring, and spring steel does fail over time, Mr Speaker, for those who have never lived outside of Parliament, it happens all the time, all metal fatigues. Would this Parliament want to see a collector with firearms from the 1700s caught up in laws designed to target criminal syndicates? Again, nothing to do with public safety. My colleague, the member for Orange, spoke of the incursion into basic common law rights. It is a dangerous step and a slippery slope to start diminishing the basic rights we as citizens of New South Wales have to procedural fairness and natural justice. The problem with all of this, even if these people are never convicted, their licence would be suspended, their firearms seized until the matter could be thrown out of court. They would have the cost and embarrassment of being charged and dragged through the court system. It is preferable these needless actions never occur. Our criminal courts should be dealing with actual criminals. The way this can be done is by changing the bill to exclude legally held firearms. By all means, Mr Speaker, throw the book at criminals, but let's not create perverse outcomes we have the opportunity to avoid. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Well, I thank the member for Barwon. I now call the member for Mile Lakes.
Mr Speaker, I rise in acknowledgement of the petition about the Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill 2020, which is subject of a recently completed parliamentary inquiry. The government is considering the recommendations of the inquiry, and I've got to say, Mr Speaker, I had the pleasure of talking with Jai about the bill and his concern and the Sporting Shooters Association's concern about the unintended consequences. As a result of that, we met and spoke about it. We've also raised it with the Minister. So let me reiterate the intent of this legislation. This bill aims to strengthen the provisions relating to taking part in unauthorised manufacture of firearms or prohibited weapons, and to clarify police powers when conducting firearm prohibition order searches. It does not criminalise legitimate firearm licence holders. We will not target or victimise legal shooters. We will not target farmers. Legitimate firearm owners can fix and maintain their registered firearms if they're a licensed firearm holder. There are two distinct matters addressed in the bill: the new offence for taking part in the unauthorised manufacture of firearms and firearm prohibition orders. The amendments are consistent with agreements that have been made at a national level. Following the Martin Place siege joint review, the then Ministerial Council on Police and Emergency Management supported a desktop review of existing firearms manufacturing offences, acknowledging that new technology have greatly enhanced the capabilities of criminals to manufacture firearms, often without great technical skill. After an extensive cross-jurisdictional review, the working group proposed an approach by which the illegal manufacture of firearms offence would have a broader application and new technologies could be captured. This national process was supported by every jurisdiction and all relevant ministers. In 2016, the New South Wales Ombudsman completed a review of the use of the FPO search powers and made a number of recommendations. The FPO amendments are a response to recommendations directed to the then Minister for Police and the Attorney General, which the government supported. There are good reasons for the amendments relating to unauthorised manufacture. Unauthorised manufacture. Currently, police are not able to take action for unauthorised manufacture unless they could prove that a functioning firearm was the end result. This new offence will close this major loophole. Under the new provisions, police may take action against a person who knowingly took part in manufacturing firearms or firearm parts, and that person either knew or reasonably should have known that manufacture was not permitted. So fixing a trigger is permitted. Maintaining your firearm is permitted, providing, of course, you have a registered firearm and you're a licence holder. It is an integral initiative to respond to serious criminals who have the means and ingenuity to seek alternatives by which to produce a firearm. It would also be an offence for a person to possess anything for the purpose of unauthorised manufacture. This includes things like moulds or parts such as handgun grips, milling equipment and computer software or plants for unauthorised manufacture. To be abundantly clear, mere possession is not an offence. It must be for the purpose of unauthorised manufacture. Let me repeat this, as this has been one of the main misunderstandings promoted about this bill, creating a lot of unnecessary confusion and fear. There is no offence of possession of a firearm precursor without the accompanying elements of the offence. The new offence broadly defines takes part to include providing finances, premises, equipment and materials of illegal manufacturing. The offence also has precedence in at least one other state jurisdiction. No one could be prosecuted merely for possessing a household item or a tool. There are also good reasons for amendments to the Firearms Prohibition Order and over and above those recommended by the Ombudsman. It's a great tool for fighting organised crimes and outlaw motorcycle gangs, and it's a great tool that the police have in their prosecutions. And in fact, they are the ones that are pushing for it to be extended to include a similar sort of order for drug suppliers. So this is a great tool targeting criminals, not ordinary citizens, not legitimate people, crooks. The new provisions seek to strengthen and clarify the firearms prohibition order search powers following a 2016 review into those powers by the Ombudsman.
Well, I thank the member for Mile Lakes. I now call the member for Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in support of this petition, which highlights the many problems with the government's firearms and weapons legislation amendment criminal use bill. This is yet another bill that shows that this government have absolutely no idea, Mr Speaker, about what happens in rural communities. National Party members who are supposed to represent the regional New South Wales are too busy living in their mansions in Drummoyne and Rushcutters Bay to pay attention to how their bills impact on those out west. I don't begrudge the Deputy Premier and the Water Minister for living in mansions in the heart of Sydney. Sydney is a nice city and they love living here. They've probably worked hard to afford their multi-million-dollar inner city properties. But the problem is they've lost touch with what happens in rural communities. They don't understand farmers and they don't understand why we need firearms. My party has a sensible approach when it comes to firearms, when it comes to consulting constituents and when it comes to addressing the needs of rural communities. When I campaigned for the seat of Murray, the Liberals and the Nationals launched a vicious scare campaign that attacked every farmer and law-abiding firearm owner in this country. Polling booths across Murray were plastered with big AK-47 posters and pictures of little children holding guns. It was gross and disgusting. They implied that gun massacres would become commonplace if people voted for me. Well, spoiler alert, none of that's happened. Murray continues to remain safe and gun-related violence continues to decline. Our party does not want an increase in gun violence or a decline in community safety. What we do want is basic fairness and for people to be consulted when government changes laws that impact on them. The criminal use bill is a bad bill for rural New South Wales. It has the potential to turn ordinary farmers into criminals. As farmers, we should have the ability to repair and modify our own equipment. We are often remote and isolated and living hundreds of kilometres from major regional towns. I grew up in that situation, I know. And we do this all the time. We have been able to repair our equipment, and guns are no exception. We've done this for centuries. Turning this sort of activity into a criminal offence is a scary sign of government overreach. What really annoys me about this bill is that the government didn't bother to speak to those impacted. Most government MPs have never been to a farm, wouldn't know what a farm was. Only Harris Farm, of course, but that's about it. I'm sure that there's a Harris Farm in Rushcutters Bay or Drummoyne or wherever else a National Party MP might live. But not out west. There's no Harris Farms out west, I'll tell you. But they really need to be speaking to those in the know before they change our lives. We see this lack of consultation all the time, on water, on hospitals, on school mergers, it goes on, the list. The rural community most affected is the last to find out. It's no wonder we see a growing gap in life expectancy between rural New South Wales and Sydney. This bill is sloppy. It does not make anyone more safe, but it puts people in my electorate at great risk. There has been an inquiry into the bill that found all sorts of problems with it. I echo the calls of my fellow party MPs in urging this government to adopt these recommendations and fix this bill. Thank you.
Well, I thank the member for Murray. I now call the minister in response.
Thank you, Speaker, and I likewise acknowledge those in the gallery today and also those that are online. And I'm pleased to contribute to this petition debate as the Parliamentary Secretary for Police and Justice and on behalf of the Minister for Police and Emergency Services. And I was also pleased to make a contribution to the second reading debate for the Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill 2020 on the 4th of March last year. And in that debate I spoke in favour of the government's proposed amendments contained in the bill, introduced in this place by the Minister on the 26th of February 2020. As indicated by many of the contributors to this petition debate, this bill is about disrupting serious organised crime and keeping our communities safe from criminal gun violence. Without these initiatives, criminals would continue to avoid prosecution. And I know that those who signed the petition did so in good faith, and I thank them for the interest they have in the workings of this Parliament. This bill does not threaten their lifestyle or their choices unless they are criminals. Petitions are an important interaction between the people of New South Wales and this Parliament, and I can assure the public and those who signed the petition that this government is aware of their views and will no doubt take them into consideration. The Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill will strengthen the provisions relating to illegal firearms and clarify police powers. The amendments contained in the bill are making the work of our police force easier and will allow them to focus on keeping our community safe. It does not criminalise legitimate firearms licence holders. The government is considering the recommendations from the parliamentary inquiry and will return the bill to the House in due course. Speaker, we should be very clear about firearms precursors. Mere possession is not an offence. It must be for the purpose of taking part in unauthorised manufacture. There is no offence of possessing a firearms precursor without the accompanying elements of the offence. This bill is about disrupting serious organised crime and keeping our communities safe. The new offence of taking part in unauthorised manufacture must be sufficiently broad to capture the facilitation of unauthorised manufacture of firearms through things like financing, providing premises or possessing firearms precursors for the purpose of unauthorised manufacture. Without this breadth, criminals will continue to avoid prosecution. As reinforced by the number of speakers today, this government has a proven record over a number of years of constructive amendments to the firearms regime. We know that firearms licence holders and sporting enthusiasts undertake their activities in a responsible and safe way. There are thousands of legitimate shooters, licensed firearm holders who possess firearms for employment, for their livelihood, as well as for sport and recreation. But we also know that criminals, especially organised crime groups, are innovative and bold about where they find loopholes in the law and can evade prosecution for their crimes. This bill is about closing those loopholes.
The question is that the House take note of this petition. I now call the member for Orange in reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the members for Barwon, Murray, Coffs Harbour, Mile Lakes and the member for Seven Hills in his capacity as Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Police for their contributions to this debate. I wish to also thank the hard work of the SSAA in New South Wales, notably State President Lance Miller and CEO Jai Rao and their board and staff. I also wish to thank my colleagues in the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party who fought hard to oppose the ill-considered harm this bill will inflict on the law-abiding firearms owners of this state. Thank you also to the shooting fraternity, including shooting and hunting clubs, firearms dealers, the farming sector, who are all united to send their message to this government. Our combined message is clear. The bill is targeted not only at criminals, but it also targets lawful licensed firearm owners quietly going about their sport. And I heard what the various speakers on behalf of the government said. Well, it all may be well and good to come into this place and wax lyrical saying it's not intended to capture law-abiding people. Well, if that's the case, put it in the legislation, insert it in the bill, insert a statutory defence so it's clear to any court in this state what the exact intention of the legislation is. Legal firearms owners will be turned into criminals if the bill is not amended. This is not an attempt to wind back the NFA, rather to ensure what is currently legal remains that way. Other jurisdictions have included a clause recognising legal firearms owners as being exempt unless they break the law. As the bill stands, it's a draconian and punitive of lawful firearms owners. The government needs to instead target criminals, and their legislation needs to clearly and unambiguously define that. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The question is that the House take note of the petition. All the opinions say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. the debate on a 20,000 signature electronic petition on the Firearms Order Members, Firearms and Weapons Legislation Amendment Criminal Use Bill having concluded. I thank members of the public listening to this debate both in the chamber and online. Members, before we get to private members,